Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to the Cywen Tyne and Humber branch webinar. This is on modelling catchment-wide natural flood management interventions. So we've got Ryan, who's going to give us a presentation shortly. I just need to run through a few housekeeping pieces here first, and then we'll get underway. So if you can use the Q&A facility to put your questions to the speaker. That's a function here in Zoom. And if you have any technical issues with the presentation and you need support, please can you use the chat feature, and Barbara, who's on the call, will help out with that. So general housekeeping then, the webinar event is being recorded and this one will be uploaded to the Cywen YouTube channel, where you can see other presentations that we've given as well. So yeah, technical issues in the chat, questions and answers in the question and answer function, and there is a CPD attributable to this webinar. However, Cywen are not going to be providing a certificate for it. So a quick update on the Tyne and Humber branch. We've got our annual general meeting coming up in April, so it would be good to have people attending that. Please look on the website for details of how to get there. A little bit about Cywen for those that are not familiar. Cywen is a Royal Chartered professional body and an independent charity, and our aim is to work towards a safer and more sustainable world, building a global community of water and environmental professionals who are dedicated to working for the public's benefit. We've switched to a virtual world, reaching out to a global audience, providing relevant and accessible events to our community working in the water and environment sector. And we help to connect local to national to international through our digital series. At the end of 2019, Cywen made a climate and ecological emergency declaration, and we are holding events and activities that address those issues. So past events have included COP26, and recordings of that are available. There is upcoming the COP27 Cywen are involved in, which is in Egypt in November this year, and the biodiversity COP15, which is taking place in China in April and May. So there are links going into the chat facility for all the recordings for those that are interested in looking at that. So upcoming events and dates for the diary for the branch. In February and March, we have a series called Beyond the Asset, which has been hosted by Stantec. So on the 10th of February, we've got Catchment Systems Opportunities event happening, and the second part of that is taking place on the 9th of March. So these are part of Stantec's Beyond the Asset series and are done in conjunction with Cywen Land and Water Digital Management series. A bit later in the year, there's Cywen Flood and Coast 2022, which is taking place between the 7th and the 9th of June. Again, links for these events will be in the chat function. The Flood and Coast Excellence Awards are now accepting nominations for outstanding initiatives up until the 13th of February. So if you have something, please put it forward. We've also got the Cywen Awards and the UK Junior Water Prize. This is for junior engineers to submit project ideas in the form of a short video or a written abstract, and the deadline for that is pretty soon. It's Friday the 4th of February. So the idea is challenging young engineers to create fresh solutions to our global water crisis. So the winning entry from the UK will represent the UK at the Stockholm Junior Water Surprise, and we'll get an all expenses paid trip to Sweden. And then at that event in Sweden, there's a chance to win $15,000 US. Okay. So that is all of the housekeeping activities. So I think it's just over to me to hand over to Ryan and say, yep, looking forward to this presentation, Ryan. So we'll let Ryan run through his slides, and then we'll take any questions at the end. So thank you, and over to you, Ryan.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, hi everyone. Pleasure to meet you all virtually. I guess we're coming obviously to maybe the end of some of these virtual presentations. Might get a bit more face-to-face interaction going on soon, but I guess we'll see how that all pans out. In terms of today, I'm not going to bore you with all the hydrological calculations and equations and mathematical statistics and things like that around the models, so you'll be pleased to hear about that. But basically, we're going to give you an overview of some of the two-dimensional catchment scale hydraulic modeling that we do in JBA, and how, in particular, we look at NFM measures and how we implement some of those into the models, and we see or quantify some of the benefits further downstream. So I'll give you a brief update on how all that works and how we add some of those interventions into the models, and then we'll move on to a bit of a case study example. So we've done some work recently for the Belford Burn catchment for the Environment Agency, which a lot of you will be very familiar with. So we've got some quite interesting results from some of the modelling there. So it's a good sort of discussion point to have on some of the results that come through. So this is obviously a image that most of you will be very familiar with as part of the evidence base for NFM. Here we are highlighting all the types of NFM measures that we might look to add into some of these models. So in particular, sort of the upper reaches of the catchment, so in terms of leaky barriers, headwater drainage, catchment woodland, things like that, and then also moving on to some of those in the lower parts of the catchment as well, so your river restoration types, your soil and land management, and your riparian woodlands. We won't be covering any of the coastal stuff within this presentation, but focusing on those top two segments there of the river channel and the catchment. And obviously all these are designed to slow and store some of the surface runoff across the catchment, and in particular those flows that are within the channel. So some of the basics of some of the modelling that we use currently. So the basics of it is we're using two-dimensional models, and the main two types of models that we use within JBA are HECRAS 2D and JBA's own JFlow. These two model softwares are very similar, and we've had a lot of benefits in using both. There's slight differences in between, but we've had a lot of use out of both of them going forward. And some of the main sort of data sets, which I'll go through, are very similar across both these model setups. So first of all, we have the digital terrain model, and a lot of you will be familiar what a DTM is. But for those that are not, it is they are grid cells that provide elevations across different parts of the UK, and they've all been surveyed at different times. So different parts of the catchment will be surveyed at different times, and they all come in different resolutions. So what we use is we use the best quality resolution that we have available, and basically what we'll have the whole catchment which is surveyed, and that resolution may vary from sort of 5 metre by 5 metre grid cells and all the way down to sort of 1 metre by 1 metre or really high resolution terrain coverage. It tends to be the case at the moment where you have your really high resolution sort of around where the river channel is, or particularly around urban areas, and when you get up towards the headwater areas, it tends to the resolution gets higher, well, gets lower and lower in terms of going up towards sort of 5 metre by 5 metre or even up to 10 metre by 10 metre coverage. and that can make some big differences in some of the ways you pick up these surface flow routes. So what we'll have is we'll have a catchment, as we can see on the right hand side here. So we have a catchment, and this catchment is split up into whatever resolution cells we have available across the catchment. So let's say, for argument's sake, these are 1 meter by 1 meter cells across the catchment. So you'll have thousands and thousands of cells all giving you an elevation, and that's how it works out where the headwaters of the catchment are all the way down to the downstream outlet as it goes out of the catchment. And obviously, yeah, that varies on what resolution is available. On top of that, we have a hydrological input. So this can be a number of things. It could just be an inflow direct into a river channel, where you just add flows into, as you would in normal sort of a 1D model. Or the way we tend to use it is by adding rainfall. So we will design this rainfall either basis of sort of design events, or the 10-year design rainfall, or the 20-year, 30-year, for instance, whatever the project is looking at. Or we could use observed rainfall from gauges. So we can actually capture past events that have been through. Let's say there's a couple of gauges within these catchments. We could pick one of the gauges and add the rainfall direct from there into the model, or we could split the catchment up spatially and add rainfall from one gauge or rainfall from another gauge at the lower catchment, for instance. So we add that rainfall to each one of those thousands of cells that's within that catchment. The second thing we do is we have a hydrological losses component to this this rainfall and this grid setup. So the losses component, again, this is spatially across the catchment. So each one of these individual cells will have its own loss coefficient. And what that's basis off is the types of soil, or the types of what the geology is underneath the soil, what the vegetation coverage is, if it's a hard surface, is it soft surface, grasses, trees, is there lots of infiltration, is there lots of evaporation, for instance. And again, that's spatially distributed. So what the model is doing is rainfall lands on these cells. The cells do their hydrological calculations in the background, and they work out how much of that rainfall is available then to run off from those cells. And then the model will look at the digital terrain that it has set up, and it works out which direction it can move from that cell. So out of those 4 cell phases, if you imagine a grid, it'll work out it can go one way or another, working on how it's going to route its way downstream. And the final aspect we have is a hydrologic roughness grid. So again, that's basis of each individual one of these cells will have its own roughness value associated with it, so a Manning's value. And again, that's based off what the land cover is. So is it a tarmac road? Is it woodland? Is it grasslands? Is it the river channel itself? Each one will have its own land cover, which you can specify. And that just, again, works out how fast the water can move from cell to cell. So you have the rainfall hitting the cells. We take away some of the losses. The cell DTM works out which direction it can go, and then the roughness works out how fast it can go. And eventually, all this flow comes together, and at your outlet or wherever you are in the channel, you get all that flow added up. So what we do in that instance is, once we've created that model, we'll have a baseline version of the model that is set up. And then we will go back into that model and we'll add in some NFM interventions, which we're going to go through now. After we've added those in, we run the model again, and then we compare the two outlets downstream in terms of either the flow or the water levels or the flood extents. So an example here, so this is some modeling work we've done recently for, well, within the QNFM project, which is a big research project that's going on at the moment. Here we have, this is Swindale Beck, right at the top of the catchment, where we are wanting to model the effects of these letterbox type leaky barriers. So we've got a number of them going down one of the main channels draining off Swindale. We also have quite a lot of peatland restoration or headwater restoration that's been going on in this area, and wanting to model some of these effects. This is a classic case where if you look at the DTM on the right hand side, we've got very high resolution DTM coverage in the lower parts of the catchment, but as we get up higher and higher, that DTM resolution gets worse and worse. So in this instance, it was a 1 meter coverage at the bottom, and you can clearly see all these fine flow pathways that are coming through. At the top of the catchment, it was a 5 meter by 5 meter resolution up there. That was just the best DTM data we had available, and we can see there's not much of that fine detail around where the flow paths are picking up. So that brings its own challenges into play when you're trying to represent something that might only be 0.5 meter wide, for instance, or the channel might only be a meter wide, and how is that picked up within the DTM. So here is an example of how they have managed to do it. So this is in Hecras. In the bottom right hand corner, we've got an actual hydrological structure that's been added into the channel, where it's highlighted in grey because they have blocked the channel across from one side of the channel to the other. They've blocked it completely, and then they've added in this little culvert structure to allow water through. So that is basically what the letterbox is in this example. But it's not picking up the DTM very well. And you can see just above that, we have an example how water is filling into the channel. But the question is, how good of a representation is that of what's actually going on in the area? One of the assumptions or limitations of this type of model in this scenario. Here we're going to go on to a little bit of recent work which has looked into different ways of modeling leaky barriers. So again, we've got two main ways really of modeling leaky barriers across a reach. So we might be able where we've got really fine detail of the channel. Again, we've got here on the right hand side, we've got Hecras where we can add that blockage across the channel, and then we've got the gap underneath the barrier. In this case, we've allowed that water to go through there, so that might be the gap that's left us for base flow to go through. What this doesn't have is the leakiness through the structure, so it's a solid blockage across the channel. So you've got water going underneath it, and you've got water going over the top, but you don't have any water going through, so you're missing that porosity example within that leaky barrier in this case. But it's, as a representation of what process is going on, it's quite a good representation in this way. Another way of doing it is just by increasing the hydraulic roughness of that reach. So as we spoke about before, one of the key elements is those roughness parameters that you use. So you could change the roughness of quite a smooth channel up to a very high value of roughness, and that will make the effect of that slowing process of water coming down. So you won't have the physical blockages of the channel, but you might have that slowed effect of water moving through the reach. And some recent work by Addy in 2019, they got some really good results in terms of comparing this type of method of modeling leaky barriers compared to actually adding in physical structures at each one. And if you've got hundreds or 200, hundreds of leaky barriers within a reach, you might be more appropriate to model it as this roughness aspect rather than going in and adding in every single barrier in that reach. And that helps out not only in the amount of time it creates to make these models, but how long it takes for the models to run, because each one of these hydraulic structures you put in is increased simulation time and increased calculations that the model has to go through, and also increased stability and all those other assumptions that you're making within the model. this is moving on to Belford. So here we've got an example of one of the pilot runoff attenuation features within the catchment. So in this example, we have, let's look at the layout at the top, the plan at the top. So we've got the channel coming down, we've got a diversion structure, we've got water spilling out of the channel because of that diversion structure into this runoff attenuation feature, which is also capturing overland flow, and then it drains back into the channel as it goes downstream. On the left-hand side, these are some of the model results. So here, even though we're in the upper parts of the catchment, and the surrounding DTM is quite poor. Again, it was sort of 2 meter coverage within this area, so it could be much better. And the channels are only sort of 1 meter wide. Fortunately enough, we had drone survey cover this whole area. So the surveyors came out and they captured the terrain in this area at 20 centimeter DTM coverage, and we could apply that directly into the model. And what we see is it clearly picks up the channel coming down. We add in the diversion structure, which again has been surveyed. We see the water coming out of the channel following these orange arrows into the structure, which again we've got the survey actually added in. This time it's a physical blockage across the DTM. We've also got that overland flow aspect coming in as well. In the middle here, just downstream of the actual structure, we've got really poor LiDAR data, and that's because of the vegetation coverage. This is a really wooded area, so you can kind of see in this area, if the structure was across here, it won't really be picking it up. But fortunately, it's a nice open field in this area, so we can get the detail of the actual terrain very well. So it's a really good representation in terms of how it should look. And then comparing that on the right-hand side here, we've got some images of how this actually looked within the September 2008 storm. And what I should say is the image on the left, the flow through there is actually the rainfall from that September event. But we see the diversion structure in picture number C pushing water out across the floodplain, and we see it storing in picture A as well. And just underneath that, we have some of the hydrographs that were pulled out of the model. So on the left-hand side, you've actually got level data within the runoff attenuation feature here, where it clearly shows that the RAF filling up and then draining down and filling up again. And here on the right-hand side, we've got the actual model results from this event, again showing exactly the same thing in terms of the hydrograph shape. So you've got that filling and draining and filling again. Here is another example where we might dive into a certain area of the DTM and physically change it. So similar to that runoff attenuation feature at Belford, here we've got a river restoration reach where we've cut it off from the main channel and burnt into the DTM a brand new channel. So that's just changing the DTM to represent these two changes, and then we can start comparing how it looks in terms of the flood extents and the flood depths at this location before and after. On to the landwise project. So again, this is another part of the NERT research project. So landwise and QNFM together, along with Protect NFM. Here we're at on the Bourne catchment as part of the larger Pangbourne. And here we have a series of leaky barriers which we've installed in Hecros. So this data we had really good representation of the channel in terms of what the DTM coverage was. The actual leaky barriers themselves, which you can see on the right-hand side, were surveyed by a PhD student, Gabby Powell, who also had monitoring equipment set up in terms of the water levels upstream and downstream across multiple ones of these features and on the main channel itself. So it really gave us a lot of detail of how to add in these physical structures, exactly what the gaps were in between or below these structures as well. So we added these into the channel. Again, we've got the before and after here. So before on the left-hand side is the same event afterwards, and we can see the deeper flood depths in the channel when you're comparing that before and after. And that's because of the leaky barriers, which are backing water up either side. And then we could do some analysis as well in terms of the hydrograph. So in this case, the peak flow drops by 9%, and then we can start using some of this monitoring data and start comparing the two, just working out exactly how well our models are representing some of the actual sort of events that's going on. I should say this was modeled for the January 2020 event, because the level loggers were implemented in 2019, and that was the biggest event that came through within that time period. So moving on to the case study example. So Belford, a lot of you will know about it. One of the pilot schemes going all the way back to 2008, when some of these features started going in to the catchment. There are numerous sort of volumes that have been quoted in terms of the amount of storage which they think has been installed within in this catchment, in terms of what runoff attenuation features and leaky barriers have been put in, up to about 12,000 cubic meters in some cases. So what we've done is we modeled the catchment, so before and after, using again that same setup in HECRAS in terms of the DTM, the land cover and rainfall, etc. We had actual recorded rainfall through the model, so we ran through various storm events in September 2008, the July 2012, and the March 2010, and they had different levels of features within the catchment. And we've got a really good calibration downstream, where there's a level gauge in the Belford village itself. So we modelled all this. Each one of the features was surveyed, so topographic survey and drone survey. So you had really high resolution DTM coverage, and where you didn't have that DTM coverage, you had topographic survey to tell us exactly what was in that area. So a really good representation of the catchment. And then we modelled it through some design events as well. So the 10-year, the 30-year, 100-year, and the 1,000-year event. And some of the results we can see the before and after. So sort of 2.5% peak flow reduction for the 10-year event, about 1.5 at the 1,000-year, and a small delay to the hydrograph peak as well. And some of these results were a bit surprising when we first looked at it, because we thought this catchment in general has got very good knowledge in terms of how these NFM features have been working within the catchment, and a lot of the local residents believe that these features have been applied within the catchment and haven't been flooded since they have been applied. So they think it's because of some of these features in. So we're looking at that and comparing sort of a 2.5% reduction and trying to compare the two together. So we did a bit more analysis on this, and we came up to some of the conclusions about the NFM maintenance. So some of these features have been in sort of 15 years, maybe more. And what we've worked out is these changes in the results could be because of multiple reasons, really. First of all, is the model set up correctly? Is there assumptions within some of those modeling results coming out, or the uncertainties within the model? And we're quite confident with that model because of all the survey data we've added in. We've got actual recorded rainfall in, and we've got a good calibration at the bottom of the catchment, but it won't be perfect in any way, shape or form. Another example could be what is the maintenance of these NFM features been in, what maintenance has been going on with these features. So over the 15 years, have they degraded over time? And it could be the case of, where is that inlet from from the stream into these features. So at what level does that inlet activate, and has that been degraded over time? We know from some pictures there might be some livestock erosion on some of the bunds that are coming in, or some of those inlet features. The channel itself might have eroded down in certain areas, so therefore they're not activating at the right time to capture the peak flow coming through. We've got sedimentation buildup. So on the left-hand side, we've got the March 2010 storm event where some of the researchers went straight out after the event and captured all this sedimentation that built up in the bottom of the bund, and none of this has been cleared out. The features have been left as they were designed 15 years ago. And some of these calculations worked out that actually from some of these quoted 12,000 or 10,000 cubic meters, when we modeled the 1,000-year event through the model, we were only getting 4,000 cubic meters of storage within the catchment. So have some of these features degraded so much that actually half of the storage has now disappeared, and that's why we're only getting sort of 2.5%. We also looked at some of the hydrographs. This is where some of the analysis comes in, where we can compare the before and after hydrographs, and here we've got a really large effect on the rising limb of the hydrograph, but actually at the peak flow there's not as much. So this feature example, which was the feature which I showed you originally in the Belford catchment, is that having a really large effect at these lower flows, but actually it's getting overwhelmed quite quickly. And is that because of that erosion or sedimentation buildup? So it's not actually having an effect at the peak, but where you really want it to have that effect. So just a lot of discussion points really to have on how these models are set up, what is the state of the NFM that you're modeling, and what sort of results are you getting through, and how you can start thinking about some of these in more detail. Okay, that's me through, so I guess I'll open up to questions.
That was great. Thank you very much. Thank you for that, Ryan. Yeah, really interesting. We've had a number of questions. It looks like about 18 on the Q&A questions in there. So I'll try and rattle through those with you now so that we can get done in the time. So Colin Roberts asked a few questions here to start with. Do you use the CEH land cover map data?
Yes, basically. We use whatever land cover data we have available. Ideally, we have the latest CEH land cover data that is 2019. We've used on a few projects, and even that comes in different resolutions, a 25 by 25 meter grid, or all the way down to sort of field size. So again, it depends what data you have available. The best quality data you put into the model equals better results at the end of it.
Thank you. Next one from Colin. Are the soil losses based on host values?
So yes, in a way. So the model is set up to use the classic sort of hydrological losses in terms of BFI host and prop wet values. So it will use that as a starting point for the model, but you can go in and physically change aspects of it if you don't think they are realistic, or if you've got actual data to back up some changes that you're making. But yeah, as the starting point, it will use that data set.
Great, thank you. Last one from Colin here. How do you derive or determine the orifice sizing on the leaky dams?
So again, it's very much dependent on what the project is that you're looking at. Typically, we tend to use sort of a 30 centimeter gap underneath the leaky barriers. That's kind of what's been typically been quoted in the past in terms of design of leaky barriers, but obviously that is very much dependent on the channel size. So you can increase that, you can decrease that if you believe that to be the case. Obviously some more guidance is coming out recent soon in terms of the Syria guidance, which I think gets released in a few days. So it might be interesting to see what comes out within that guidance document in terms of that leaky barrier gap. But the other way is, of course, if you've got topographic survey of the leaky barriers, which we had in some of those examples, you can use the exact values that is given on those.
Great, thanks. Got a question from Stuart Smart. Are there any losses from the flows once it starts moving down the catchment, e.g. flows move to a downstream cell and then infiltrates or evaporates?
So no, not at this case. So in these models, the only losses aspect you have is when the rainfall originally hits the terrain. After that point, there are no further losses going through, so you allow all that water to move through the catchment. Obviously, in some cases, that might not be quite representative of what the catchment is doing, but that's where you might be able to modify some of those losses to try and to work that out in terms of if you've got data to prove it.
Great, thanks. Question from Shafina Hamid. Have you tried modelling the digital terrain model for different terrains and vegetations, such as rainforests?
No, this is only focused on UK based. UK based catchments. So no, we haven't looked at those personally.
Okay, this one's anonymous. Does the digital terrain model provide the channel bed level or the water surface level at the time of survey?
Again, it's very sort of dependent on when that survey was taken. So in certain catchments, so what happens is the survey is collected by flights, so LiDAR flights that go over the top of the catchment, and they fire down what's the word, lasers to the ground, and then it records what comes back basically to the flight in terms of, that's how it works out what the elevation is. So where you've got woodland coverage or large vegetation coverage, it can fall down a little bit if that gets caught out in terms of if it hits some of those trees and can't actually penetrate to the floor. With water in the channel, again, it does struggle sometimes to meet the actual bed levels of the channel, but it depends what sort of condition that channel is in when that flight goes over. If it's in low flows condition, it will pretty much capture the full channel width, but if it's in flood conditions when it goes through, obviously it'll probably will only capture up to where that channel where the water level is in that circumstance. So there's a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes in terms of analyzing what the actual data is that you have.
Great, thank you. Question from John Easton. How is infiltration applied? He says, I'm a two-flow user, so I'm used to the green method and initial loss and continuing loss. So two-flow is very sensitive to soil type, hard to be accurate across a catchment scale.
So yeah, we base it, I think I kind of covered it in one of the other answers, but it's based off this BFI host and prop web catchment descriptor value, and that we spatially apply that over the catchment. So even though you might have one set of descriptive values for the whole catchment, we split it up based off geology really. We can do it to a finer scale in terms of looking at the C-NINI value, which is the initial soil moisture. So if we've got that data available, we can go down that route and look at what the antecedent conditions were of the soils, how wet it was, how dry it was, and start working out the losses based off that.
Great, thank you. Question from Paul Campbell. How does the accuracy of the roughness method for leaky dams vary during events with increased flow and depth, and how would it represent overtopping?
I would, if in terms of the roughness value, I would advise you to look at that AD 2019 paper, because it's got all that information within there.
Okay, thank you. How can the model, oh sorry, question from Matt Jackson. How can the model be adapted to take account of climate change scenarios over time and evolving landscapes?
Evolving landscapes is a hard one, because it's only the DTM data that you have available unless you physically go in and make changes to it. So the Belford one was a good example of that. Is we had two different LiDAR flights. We had the 2019 recent 1 meter coverage, and then we had I think it was like a 2000 older version of the LiDAR. So when we were comparing the pre/post NFM scenario, we were using the older 2000 to give us the terrain data without any of the features in, and then the newer 2020 version to have sort of some of the aspects of the features and adding the survey data on top of those. So that's one way you can do it, but other than that, if you don't have the data and it's just what you'll manually change. Climate change wise, you can just you can increase your rainfall to represent that climate change, or increase your hydrological input, same way you would do for a normal sort of 1D or 2D model. You're increasing the flows by X amount to cover the climate change. You just increase your hydrological input.
Great, thank you. Question from Emily here. Can the roughness parameters be time dependent? For instance, as the channel fills up, the leaky barriers may not be effective, and so its representative roughness would change.
They can be. They can also be depth variable as well. We don't tend to use it because, again, it's increasing more and more the amount of assumptions that you're making within the model, the uncertainty around of the actual equations themselves that are in there, and you're increasing that all the calculations that the model has to do in the background. So you're increasing processing time, etc. on top of that. So and you get very small benefit at the end of the day. If you were really going down the detail of looking into it, then yeah, you could use that.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. Question from Colin Roberts regarding the stream spills. Are you following any kind of relict channel or creating new flow paths and overspill channels?
You can check for like new channels that have been created. So one way of analysing some of these features is to compare before and after flood extents or flood depths, and in some cases you can push water out in a different direction. So that's a good way of checking some of these model results to see how are these NFM features actually performing, and if that's what you're wanting to do in terms of push water out, then you can test it in that way.
Great, thank you. Question from Adam Broadhead. Even the drone digital terrain model will overestimate net runoff because drone and LiDAR data doesn't capture below the water surface, so it doesn't capture the true bed or channel volume. Therefore, are you stamping down the digital terrain model to gain the true channel volume, or are you scaling down rainfall to remove a base flow component?
Yeah, so again, it compares to what data you have available within that model. So if you've got topographic survey available, like we did it at the Belford catchment, then we can go in and physically change the dimensions of the channel to match what the survey is telling us. Where we don't have that data, then yeah, there are assumptions to be made there in terms of how you represent some of the surface flows that are coming in.
Thank you. Got a question from Alex Walsh and Alex Byrne here saying, how are the hydraulic models calibrated and verified?
So again, very, very dependent on what data you have. It's always a case of more data you've got, the better the results are going to be. So if you've got gauge data downstream, if you've got like in the Pangbourne catchment, we had level gauges at loads of the leaky barriers. We had level gauges, level monitoring equipment, sorry, in terms of what's in the channel itself. So you get an idea of if you're adding on the exact rainfall of that event and you're matching that up to those level gauges, then you can be pretty happy with some of the processes that's going on within the model. If you don't have any of this data, then you're really limited on what you can calibrate and validate too. So as a bare minimum, you can look back at sort of past flood events that have been through the catchment. You know, do you have historic flood outlines? How do they match up? Do you know a certain property flooded within for a certain event type, and you can check that back, and you can always compare it back to sort of flooded extents or flood depths from other model results, or maybe like surface water outline, or the risk of flooding, you know, the flood alert areas and all that stuff. Really, it depends what data you have available.
Great, thank you. I think this next question is on a similar line, really, from Adam. So, hydrological losses are key. How much model verification, soak-away tests, or calibration against gauged events to confirm accuracy is possible, given most catchments are poorly gauged, or is it dealt with through sensitivity testing and the use of modelling only as a comparative exercise rather than absolute? And how does this then impact the EA confidence in comparing natural flood management against other more engineered solutions?
Yeah, so as a standard, you do sensitivity testing. Well, for all EA projects, as you know, that is the standard to do. So that's one way of working out exactly how these models are performing. But again, it's all based off what data you have available to start with and what the project is actually for, and a lot of it comes down to how much time and budget you've got available for the modelling. You could do a hell of a lot for thousands and thousands of pounds, but most projects don't have that available. So what you can do within the budget.
Great, thank you. Question from Calorin Roberts. Why is the peak flow reduction greater as a percentage for more extreme events? It seems counterintuitive.
Well, it could be dependent, really. It could be how are your features designed. It tends to be the case that we see in NFM, as the flood magnitude increases, your benefits decrease. But if your features are designed to capture the 30-year event, then the 10-year event or the 5-year event might not be as attenuated as that 30-year event. So that's one way that could be the case. It depends on how these features are designed. You know, where is that inlet? You know, if you've got water spilling out of the main channel, at what level does it start spilling out? And that sort of that design aspect.
Great, thank you. Still got questions coming in, Ryan, as well. Question here from Sarah Sims. How sensitive is the modelling to the gaps that you define? I'm conscious that in the future we may want to use modelling to assess the potential impact of leaky dams ahead of the construction, and this may vary when built. Do you have a feel for how important this is?
Yeah, so I think most people know in terms of the number of uncertainties that are with modelling. Again, we can kind of fall back on that aspect of if you've got the data available, then you improve those model uncertainties, but no model is going to be perfect. There's always going to be assumptions being made. These hydrological processes that are going on are very complex, and the model can only use simple versions of these complex processes that are going on. So if it was a case that where you wanted to really look into detail on leaky barriers, and you had to get the detail right in the model, then you would require monitoring data to back up what the model is showing.
Thank you for that. Another question from Adam Broadhead here. Is there guidance on how positioning of leaky barriers is targeted, e.g. Looking for floodplain reconnection? Because when the channel is incised, the morphological changes of sediment deposition at leaky barriers will be key over their lifetime, as in zero-stage restoration. How is this morphological change, natural flood management performance over time, best captured into the modelling to demonstrate to stakeholders, e.g., renewal costs or sensitivity testing with performance deterioration?
Yeah, so with leaky barriers in particular, we often have come to the conclusion where the best benefits you have are where you can force water out onto the floodplain, and you've almost got an endless amount of storage if you can get water out and into a floodplain storage bund or anything like that. And that's another example of when return period goes up in magnitude, you could actually get more and more benefits if you get more and more access to that floodplain. So in general, we try to look at, when we're looking at NFM feasibility, we look for those areas first in terms of how can you use leaky barriers to get water out onto the floodplain. If you're only using in-channel storage alone, you get very small results in terms of sort of 1-2% reduction, which in turn might be very beneficial, but in terms of actual flood benefits downstream, probably not as valuable as the actual use of the floodplain to get water out onto the floodplain, that lateral flow sort of movement. Let's see what comes out in the next few days in this Syria NFM guidance document.
Great, thank you. Question from Emily Shipton. You've mentioned high resolution monitoring data at leaky dams. Do you think this could be used to build up an inventory of natural flood management hydraulics and therefore develop specific structure units within modelling software? Or do you think existing structure units and roughness changes do a good enough job?
It's something that definitely could be looked at as you probably have to go down the research route in terms of research and development to develop these models further. More processes that you can simulate, probably the better the models are going to be. But it's all a case of if you've got that data available, and how accurate is that data. We're getting more and more monitoring all the time at the moment in terms of what we had 2 or 3 years ago. So it's all good data that's coming through.
All right, thank you. Question from Colin Roberts here. A wider question regarding natural flood management approaches to flood peaks. Is it really worthwhile applying the rarer rainfall peaks when the more frequent rainfall peaks in QMED are more likely more important?
Yeah, so we've like we're saying, we find that as soon as those flood magnitudes get too high, then in general the NFM benefit decreases. So we try and focus on smaller, more frequent events. It tends to be, again, depends what the project is about. There's normally a lot of focus on those sort of 100-year event or 200-year event for designing flood defences, and it does tend to be the case that a lot of clients and things like that ask for those specific events to be modelled through. But we always try and push towards, let's focus on those more frequent events if possible.
Great, thanks. Question from Nicola Ellis. Really interesting work into natural flood management lifespan. Is there any plan to take this forward, such as modelling how natural flood management degrade over time and how best to maintain them?
In terms of the maintenance aspect, I think there should be more that's coming out in this new guidance document. But again, let's wait and see what comes out with that. In terms of the modelling processes, I guess again it depends what projects sort of the Environment Agency or the Rivers Trust are looking to do. If that's something they are looking to do, then it can be done within the model. So
great, thanks. Question I think might be covered by that new guidance from Matt Langdon here. Will any best practice for modelling natural flood management intervention be published?
Yeah, let's look at what comes out in this guidance. There is the evidence base as well, which came out obviously a few years ago. So there is some general guidance within there, but in terms of actual design of NFM, then let's see what comes out, like I say, over the next few days.
Thanks. Question from Nick Maynard. Have there been any studies on the performance of leaky barriers, i.e. their known ranges of performance for typical construction techniques?
There's been lots of research projects going on. So the 3 big QNFM, landwise NFM and protect NFM projects that are coming out, they'll all be releasing papers on some of the findings on there. Some of which will include leaky barriers. There's lots of, like I said, the work on the Pangbourne catchment, that's with a PhD student from the University of Reading who's doing all that good work on there. There's lots of sort of recent PhD research or recent papers that are coming out more and more in terms of the leaky barriers performance and design and things like that.
Thank you. A question from Simon Bond. In the second case study, the leaky woody barriers were modelled as raised digital terrain model ridge rather than as a roughness modification alone. How was this ridge set up to allow a limited percentage of flow through the feature?
So it's set up as a blockage across the channel, almost like a weir structure. So you see in the model water flowing down the channel, it hits the blockage and then flows over the top of it or around it, depending on the size of the feature. We then add in the culvert at the bottom of the feature to act as the gap underneath it, and that was all based off survey information. So if we had a gap of 40 centimeters or 50 centimeters, whatever it was, we added a gap underneath for flow to get under the barrier, and then once that was used up, it would back up behind it and then flow over the top.
Great, thank you. A question from Martin Spears. Are the infiltration losses assumed constant throughout the event? And if so, what impact do you think reducing the losses as the ground gets wetter would have?
So yeah, they are worked out from when you press go on the model, and then the set at that time. So the set at time 0, if you're running it for 300 hours, it'll work out the infiltration from when you set it in the equation detail that you give it at the start. But there's a bit in that in terms of looking at antecedent conditions and using that seen-in value if that data is available to use, where you can look at some of the how wet the soil is, how dry the soil is, to work out that condition.
Great, thank you. Question from Kyle Somerville. Was consideration given to using other packages that could maybe better represent leaky features, e.g. Innovise ICM porous polygons with crest elevations?
For these projects, they weren't. Obviously, each modeling software has its own benefits, and there's a good sort of spreadsheet that was set up again a few years ago, part of the evidence base, where it described of sort of what models should be used and for certain aspects. We like using this JFlow and HECRAS 2D version because of the general sort of catchment scale work that you can get on if you wanted to do some bits in more detail or certain other aspects of things in more detail. Then over modeling software might be more appropriate.
Great, thank you. Question from Michael Rea. What roughness coefficient range would be typical for natural flood management features in broad scale modelling?
Depends what the feature is, really. If it's grassland up to woodland features, then we tend to use sort of 0.1 for woodland. If you're changing the channel characteristics, or you're changing the floodplain characteristics, or the ones specified in that AD 2019 paper so they were using sort of 0.2 for the leaky barrier reach through there, because really high roughness values going through. Yeah, it's very dependent on what feature you're trying to model, in the certain ranges where of those features.
Okay, thank you. Question from Samuel Hotchkiss. What do you use to modify the digital terrain model? For example, when creating a new channel or river restoration site, is this through HEC-RAS or other GIS software?
You can use, either really. HEC-RAS has its own inbuilt features that you can use to modify parts of the terrain, or you can use sort of ArcGIS or QGIS tools to modify it.
Right, okay. Has the research project considered using 2Flow? Question from Matt Langdon.
I'm not sure which research projects they're on about.
Okay, I'll question from Louise. Is the infiltration rate varied to accommodate changes to the catchment SMDs, or is this set at one rate?
The infiltration rate is set spatially, but it's set at the start of the model.
Okay. Anonymous question. Have you used the modelling to estimate the number and type of interventions needed to reduce flood risk?
That's typically what we use this type of modelling for. For feasibility studies of catchment scale NFM.
Question from Alex. Do the models account for land management practices? And are our losses purely based on mineral fraction of soil? I would expect the organic fraction to exert significant influence on losses.
Yeah, so there might be some more knowledge coming out of the landwise NFM project around that, in terms of how you might change some of the parameters to represent sort of soil improvement, or changes from different land uses to others. So that's due to be finished sort of summertime. So again, see what happens with coming out in terms of that. But we do model sort of soil and land management improvement as sort of basic average sort of uplift in terms of infiltration going into the soil. But it's all very, very simple at this scale.
Question from Carolyn. Given that the overall reductions in peak flow are low, should we abandon attempts to use natural flood management, or just adjust the types that we use for particular circumstances?
Depends what you're using natural flood management for. I mean, all of the multiple benefits that you get with NFM, it's not purely focused on flood risk in terms of your biodiversity improvements, environmental improvements that come with it. If you're purely going down a flood risk idea in terms of there is no other benefit, it's purely for flood risk, then you're going to have to put a hell of a lot in a catchment to see significant benefit. But that does vary on catchment size, catchment conditions, so it's all very appropriate to what the catchment is and what your project is looking to do.
Okay, question from David Kennedy. It seems that you need to do natural flood management at a greater scale to make some significant differences. What would be a target volume per meter cubed to per kilometre squared to, say, reduce the hydrograph by 20%? In a 1 in 30, we have been using 10,000 meters cubed per 1 kilometre squared.
Yeah, I think Nick Chappell at Lancaster University has quoted something similar in that's in the QNFM project. I can't remember if he's released a paper on it or not, but it's basically, if you're focusing purely on storage, then yeah, you do need a hell of a lot within a catchment. One way to look at it might be to really limit your catchment down and focus entirely on sort of really small scale catchments above populations at risk. So some more work that's come out of the QNFM project and what we're using more and more is focusing on sort of 10 kilometre square catchments that are immediately upstream of a community, and that's where you get some really good benefits in terms of NFM.
Thank you. Question from Mike Wood. Do you carry out sensitivity testing of the natural flood management parameters?
Yes, it's a standard for PA modeling, yeah.
Question from Simon Blacksall. Were nutrient loads considered during the design or assessment of the natural flood management features, for example, impacts on dissolved oxygen, phosphorus, nitrogen with respect to the locations of the feature?
It's not something we test about in some of this modelling projects that we look at.
Okay, question from Rian Hamer. Features tend to focus on leaky barriers. Have you looked at other features within the modelling?
Yes, so woodland planting, runoff attenuation features, soil and land management improvements, you know, all those features that are highlighted at the start of the talk on that conceptual diagram. We've looked at pretty much all of them at one stage or another.
Last couple of questions, Ryan. From David Sutherland here. How long are the letterboxes and RAFs expected to last? And is there a plan for when they start to fail? If natural processes are boosted, then the leaky dam should hopefully be replicated as natural log jams over time if the riparian conditions are suitable. Is this the case?
So I think those letter type boxes that we showed in those earlier slides, exactly that, it's temporary measures and then hopefully natural processes take over. I think that's the plan with some of them. Again, it's all down to sort of the design of the features and how long they're designed for, but in particular sort of leaky barriers, if you're using natural wood, it will decade over time and you might need to go in there and maintain it. And like we saw with the Belford example, some of the sedimentation buildup or livestock erosion on the features, you know, it will require maintenance over time.
Question from Duncan Chapman. Belford is known as a dense natural flood management catchment with 40 plus natural flood management features, but do outcome from pre and post natural flood management is negligible for peak flows and differences could be within bands of uncertainty. When should we spend considerable time and money modelling natural flood management, or should we just go out and build the features?
Duncan would give me the hardest question, who also worked on this project. It's hard to, it depends on the project and project needs in terms of the modelling process. You know, modelling can be expensive to run and sometimes the benefits are not as what you expect, but in order of quantifying some of the benefits that you need, and sometimes sort of ordering watercourse consents or environment agency or some of these bodies might require some of that you know, evidence to show that these features are actually working as they should be designed. So it depends again what you're using the modeling for, and if you're modeling, you know, what the project is for. If you're looking for areas to target, then modeling can be very valuable in some of that.
Great, okay, thank you, Ryan. Last one here, I'm not sure which bit this relates to, but it says, is that the evidence base from CEH research?
Yes, I think it is.
Yeah.
It might be the Environment Agency one. I can't remember off the top of my head.
I think that's the end of the questions anyway. Just a couple of comments there about the upcoming Syria document. So yeah, thank you very much for that, Ryan. Really good presentation. I think you've dealt with 40 something questions there at the end. So thank you to everybody who's participated, listened to the presentation and put your questions in. This is probably one of the better events that we've had attendances. I think it was 390 people joined in at the peak there. So thank you to everybody who came, and thanks again to Ryan for his presentation and responding to all those questions. So see you later, everyone. Have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.